The Death Head Stamp. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the last straw. Parliament had passed a new tax. Now every piece of paper that changed hands in the colonies, every newspaper, marriage license, will, diploma, and land deed had to carry a British stamp before it could be considered legal. And the colonists had to pay for those stamps. People were furious. Riots broke out in Boston. In other cities, there were demonstrations and violent speeches against the British. To many, the Stamp Act seemed like the death of liberty. Americans didn't mind paying taxes to their local governments. That seemed fair because they elected their own representatives. But there was nobody to represent them in the British Parliament. The Stamp Act was taxation without representation. It could not be allowed. So let's just review what they just said. So there were more taxes placed on the colonists to try to get that money back from the expensive war. And the people were really upset because they were paying their money to the people in Britain who are making all these rules and laws, but they don't get any say in the rules and laws being made. So that's where that statement, no taxation without representation, comes from. If they are going to pay money towards a government, they want to have some kind of a say in the rules and laws that are being made. That's the representation part. Groups of angry men formed bands called the Sons of Liberty. They burst into the homes of stamp tax collectors and warned them to resign. Ooh. If a stamp tax collector refused, the Sons of Liberty threw rocks through his precious windows. Glass was very expensive. If he still held out, they smashed his house and all of his belongings. Oh. Naturally, hardly any stamps were sold. Parliament finally gave in and repealed the Stamp Act. So repealed means they took it back. They undid it. I think they saw that they weren't successful. People were not buying the stamps, and all they were doing was being violent towards those stamp tax collectors. So Parliament gave in and repealed the Stamp Act. What wonderful news! Bells rang out in every city. People danced in the streets. They cheered and drank toasts to good King George. Long live the king! They were sure that the king was on their side. Now they thought America would be treated fairly at last. Dun dun dun! Do you think they're right? Do you think it's over? Did the colonists win? Did the British government give up that easily? Not so sure. All right, let's check out some of the pictures and captions. If a stamp tax collector refused to resign, he was sometimes chased out of town by a mob carrying clubs and throwing stones. Oh boy. Violence is never the answer, right? But the colonists are upset. The colonists drew stamps with a skull and crossbones. This was to show their belief that the Stamp Act was the death of liberty. So, kind of like a protest that they are having. Who were the Sons of Liberty? They were groups of men opposed to Britain's treatment of the colonies. Some were poor, uneducated workers. Others were wealthy merchants, lawyers, and teachers. Not all of them believed in mob violence, but the threat of it scared their opponents. So it's almost like a club or a gang. Sorry, just adjusting my floor and camera setup here. Ebenezer McIntosh, a shoemaker, led a gang that joined the Sons of Liberty. They tore down the houses of stamp tax collectors and other British officials. They were always ready for a fight. McIntosh ran among his men, shouting orders through his speaking trumpet. One night, an effigy of Andrew Oliver, who had been appointed stamp tax collector for Massachusetts, was hung from the Liberty Tree. An effigy of a boot with the devil crawling out of it was also hung from the Liberty Tree. The boot stood for Lord Bute, a British politician whom the colonists hated. They considered him responsible for the Stamp Act. The reason that I paused was because I was just trying to make sense of the picture and the words. So this is not actually the stamp tax collector who got hung. An effigy is like, I'd have to look it up. Hey Google, what's the definition of effigy?
Here's the definition of effigy: a sculpture or model of a person.
Okay, so it's a fake model of the person. So it was like a threat. They hung a dummy of Andrew Oliver, trying to make him feel scared for his life. So that's what the word effigy means. So it's not really Andrew Oliver, and it also was an effigy of a boot with a devil crawling out of it, and they're just sort of using those things to intimidate him or the other tax collectors in town. Thanks, Google.